Today we are continuing kind of our little series of events looking at historic presidential elections and how they have impacted or involved the state of West Virginia. Our program two weeks ago dealt with Barry Goldwater in the 1964 election and how that significantly impacted the career of one West Virginia congressman. And today we're looking at the previous election to that, 1960 election. And this one is an interesting story, and I'll preface it by saying that I spent a lot of time researching this topic for a lesson plan module that we have on the Byrd Center's website called Redeveloping Appalachia, legislating the future of West Virginia. And we published that teaching module last year, and our Teacher Institute last summer was the first time that we got to demonstrate it with teachers and to show them, to take them through these materials. It uses about 150 pages of documents from our archives here at the center, from Senator Byrd's collection and also from the Harley Staggers Senior collection. And a lot of the materials that you're seeing today in this presentation were found and put together as part of that effort. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the 1960 election, and particularly John F. Kennedy's role in West Virginia in that campaign, and how that really set the stage for quite a dramatic era for West Virginia and Appalachia as a region, and setting that within the national context as well. So we're going to begin by looking a little bit at what Appalachia was like in 1960. So coming out of World War II, the coal industry in West Virginia and the Appalachian states kind of came over a little bit of a bump of activity that had taken place during World War II to sort of fuel the military-industrial complex during the height of production in the war. But as soon as we emerged from World War II, that boom very quickly turned to bust and left the coal industry sort of back in the state of decline that it had been in prior to the war during the Great Depression. In the 1950s, as the energy market is taken over by oil and coal is losing its footing, that in addition to mechanization of the coal mining industry leads to a loss of 60,000 jobs previously held by miners just in the decade of the 1950s. Between 1940 and 1970, 3 million people will leave Appalachian states. It is one of the largest population diasporas in American history. And it ends up really causing a major issue for West Virginia in particular, where our economy was so much tied up and based in one industry. So for West Virginia, the situation was pretty bleak. As the population was declining and jobs were drying up, it also meant that West Virginians were facing a lot of problems with crumbling infrastructure, dealing with roads and town water systems that had mostly been built by coal companies back in the 1920s and 30s, and then without the coal industry there to provide the support to maintain them, began to really crumble. So this is the situation in West Virginia. Throughout the 1950s, the state's delegation in Congress had been trying to come up with solutions to this crippling issue and trying to pass legislation, but not finding much support in the Eisenhower administration. And this is the situation that John F. Kennedy enters into in 1960. So right around this time, there are a lot of interesting publications that come out, sort of exposing the depth of the problems in West Virginia and in Appalachia as a whole. Night Comes to the Cumberlands, a book published by Harry Caudle of Kentucky, really paints the grim reality that Appalachians were facing in their communities, and sets the stage for this issue really becoming a part of the national conversation that will eventually lead to the Great Society. As you can see, the cover of his book, which is on the screen, at the bottom of the cover are the words, "The First Frontier in the War on Poverty." War on poverty, of course, is going to become one of those statements that comes to define the Great Society push later in the 60s. One of the more interesting publications dealing with West Virginia was a Saturday Evening Post issue in 1960, the cover story being, quote, "The Strange Case of West Virginia." You see the title, the first page of that article on the screen. And this article kind of delves into a exploration of the irony of a state like West Virginia that was so rich in resources, but was plagued by chronic poverty and very low standards of living for a majority of its population. And of course, it dabbles into the stereotypical depictions of West Virginians. You see in that document the juxtaposition of a photograph of what most people in America at that time would think of as a hillbilly family. And below that is a picture of the Greenbrier Resort. So this clear juxtaposition of the extremes on either side of the economic spectrum in West Virginia at the time. The article goes into looking at the history of this. It talks a little bit about the role of extractive industry in the state and having sort of led to this problem. And it kind of becomes a cause that the members of the state legislature take up. Senator Byrd gives a speech on the floor in his freshman term directly addressing this article. And while he tries to give some defense for his state in ways that it is at that time traditionally maligned in the national conversation, he is frank in saying there are serious problems that require the federal government to address, and that he and his colleagues had been working on trying to change for quite some time. So this was not lost in the conversation swirling around the Democratic primary in 1960. And more than any other candidate, the other candidates at the time in this primary included Lyndon Johnson, Hubert Humphrey. John F. Kennedy sets his sights on West Virginia and travels extensively throughout the state in 1960. He appears in small towns as well as cities across the state, giving speeches, meeting with West Virginians. In Charleston on April 11th, 1960, at the Civic Center, then candidate Kennedy gives a speech in which he says, quote, "No community is an island cut off from the rest of America. What happens in West Virginia happens to all of us, and America has failed in its responsibilities to you. This is a fact of terrible urgency and a challenge to the leadership of the next president of the United States." So already Kennedy is framing the problems in Appalachia as both an error of omission on the part of the federal government's attention, and also placing it within the construct of what would come to be referred to as the new frontier, and ultimately what molds into becoming the Great Society under LBJ after President Kennedy's assassination in 1963. So appearing all around the state and meeting with people in coal camps and mining communities and cities, Kennedy is working to really position himself as a candidate that will make a change for West Virginia. He makes promises. He issues a directive that will kind of shape policy down the road in that same Charleston speech that I quoted from, he gives an idea of 3 areas in which West Virginia could be helped directly by federal policy. 1 being setting a minimum standard for unemployment benefits. 2 being the creation of an aid program that would deliver surplus food supply to communities in West Virginia. And 3 was the investment of federal dollars through projects and through relocation of federal agencies to West Virginia. Quite ironically, this is a lot of what Senator Byrd was talking about at the time, though Senator Byrd was not at this point a supporter of Kennedy. He was supporting either LBJ or, once LBJ was out, Hubert Humphrey in the primary. The same was not true for the rest of the West Virginia delegation. As President Kennedy continued his journey around the state and making appearances, members of the West Virginia delegation did come out to speak for him. As we talked about in our program 2 weeks ago, one of John F. Kennedy's close friends when he was serving as a member of the House of Representatives was Harley Staggers of West Virginia. Their offices were next to each other in the office building in House office building in DC. And there's a photograph here of Congressman Staggers giving a campaign address in support of Kennedy in West Virginia in 1960. So as the delegation kind of lines up behind Kennedy, they really see an opportunity. And his successful victory in the campaign of 1960 really sets the stage for a decade of tremendous and dramatic change for West Virginia and the Appalachian region as a whole. So it's at this point that I get to introduce another person in West Virginia congressional history who is not examined often enough or not remembered frequently enough, and that is West Virginia's first Congresswoman, Elizabeth Key from Bluefield. She is part of another one of those West Virginia political dynasties that had 3 generations or 3 different members over 2 generations representing West Virginia's southern coal fields in the national legislature. Her husband, John Key, had been a member, and when he died, she was appointed to fill his seat, as was often the case in this era. That's how many women first arrived in Congress. But she would go on to be elected in her own right for 7 terms into the House of Representatives, and led a really prolific career, becoming a very outspoken supporter for veterans' rights, becoming a person who was championing women's causes in the time. The photograph that you see on the screen, she's the woman all the way on the left wearing the glasses and the hat and the pearls, is when President Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act into law. And most importantly for our story today, throughout the 1950s, Elizabeth Key and other members of the delegation had been crafting a legislative program. In her words, she termed it as a Marshall Plan for the United States. And coming out of World War II, she would frequently give speeches saying that the United States was spending and investing millions and billions of dollars abroad to rebuild countries and economies that had been destroyed by World War II under the Marshall Act. And what she was calling for essentially was a domestic Marshall Plan, that we needed to be investing in communities right here in America that were facing similar socioeconomic problems to war-torn countries in Europe, including her own district in West Virginia. She had proposed legislation a few times in the late 1950s, but failed to win the support of enough members or of President Eisenhower to really push it forward to passage. But with President Kennedy in the White House, the opportunity was rife to create this initial program. The rest of the delegation at the time is also really working toward this goal. And on the screen here, you see pictures of the entire delegation. West Virginia had 6 members in the House of Representatives in 1960, and of course its 2 senators. On the left, you see Senator Jennings Randolph and Senator Byrd. And then the photograph on the right, which is one of my favorites that we have in the collection, depicts the House delegation in 1960. From left to right is Congressman John Slack. Next to him is Congresswoman Elizabeth Key. And continuing on, Congressman Ken Heckler, Congressman Arch Moore, who was the lone Republican on the delegation at the time and representing the 1st District, Congressman Staggers Sr., and at the very end there is Congressman Cleveland Bailey. He would be the first one in that group to leave Congress. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the state's population is rapidly decreasing at this time. So in the 1970 election and the 1960 election, 1970 election, and 1990 elections, we are after the census is taken in those years, West Virginia loses progressively seats in the House of Representatives till we arrive at our present 3 seats. So Congresswoman Key, finally, with a supportive voice in the White House, a candidate who had gone around West Virginia promising to do something to address the economic plight of Appalachia, takes the opportunity, and she wins passage of a proposal that she had worked on with other members in the House that came to be known as the Area Redevelopment Act. This bill was signed into law in 1961 by President Kennedy, and it essentially set up a program kind of like the Small Business Loan Administration that we have today. It provided low-interest federal loans to private corporations, but it also had money allotted for limited public works projects. And I'll show you toward the end of the program today how we use this and all of these materials in our educational module for students. But this bill really is a crucial step in getting to what President Kennedy had been promising West Virginians and what ultimately will become the Appalachian Regional Development Act, passed in 1965. So almost immediately after the Area Redevelopment Act goes into law in 1961, it has its critics. There are people who feel that it doesn't go far enough, that the focus on business, propping up businesses through low interest loans was important, but it wasn't getting to the heart of the issue, that there needed to be much more concentrated and expanded federal spending and investment into the Appalachian region. That is demonstrated in this letter written by Senator Byrd to President Kennedy in 1962, when he says that he's proposing a bill, an amendment to the Area Redevelopment Act that would create a civil works program that would provide $3 million and ultimately not to exceed $50 million as the program was rolled out, in money that could be invested directly in civil works across West Virginia. So we're already seeing this effort afoot to try and advance on what had been accomplished in 1961. And what this ultimately spurs is the creation of the President's Appalachian Regional Commission in late 1961. And President Kennedy tasks this group with coming up with a proposal of a major legislative program to aid West Virginia. At this point, they're taking up what Harry Caudle had been calling for in Night Comes to the Cumberlands, and essentially creating the sort of an idea of a new Tennessee Valley Authority for Appalachia, for West Virginia in particular, for the case of its delegation. And that commission meets throughout 1962 and 1963, conducting economic studies of Appalachian states. And at this point, I probably should state what the federal government at least defines as Appalachia. It is all of these states ranging from New York to Mississippi, in which the Appalachian mountain chain runs. But West Virginia is the only state within that region to be entirely contained within Appalachia. Our neighboring states have portions of their states that are covered in Appalachia, Western Maryland, for instance, or Eastern Kentucky. but West Virginia is completely covered within that federally defined Appalachian region. So the impact of all of this action, all of this legislation, is felt most acutely in West Virginia. And that is what they're aiming to do with this legislation. So as the commission meets, they initially come up with a plan that is issued in early 1964. So of course, by this time, President Kennedy has been assassinated, and Lyndon Johnson, vice president, has taken over as president, fulfilling the remainder of President Kennedy's term. But he is also supportive of this idea that had started under Kennedy. And so he takes the work of the President's Commission and begins to lay the groundwork for the creation of a program. The commission had come out with 5 areas that they felt needed to be addressed in whatever program was created for Appalachia. And those 5 areas of investment were in education, healthcare, job creation, conservation, and in infrastructure. So those 5 areas were what the commission said needed significant and concerted federal investment in order to really lift the Appalachian region out of its chronic socioeconomic issues. So as the delegation continues to work with President Johnson, in 1964, these ideas are finally cemented into a plan called the Appalachian Regional Development Act. It passes the Senate in 1964, but fails to pass the House before the end of the session. And so early in 1965, it is reintroduced, and it is passed into law. It is one of the first Great Society programs, one of the first programs targeted at the war on poverty that Lyndon Johnson at this point had been talking about. And what is interesting in the creation of this bill is that because it becomes a part of the larger Great Society vision, the President's Commission's 5 points of focus end up getting changed around a little bit because President Johnson and his allies on Capitol Hill are wanting to create national programs that address some of these matters. So ultimately, by the time that the ARC is passed in 1965, those 5 areas are dropped to 3 areas of focus for this specific program. And they are education, healthcare, and infrastructure. And that's really what defines the early period of investment through the ARC. What the ARC is, the Appalachian Regional Commission, is a body made up of the 13 governors of the Appalachian states, plus 2 presidential appointees. They receive an annual appropriation from Congress, and then they meet to review applications for that funding and to distribute it appropriately to meet those stated goals of the program: education, advancement, healthcare facilities, and infrastructure improvements. So as the ARC is implemented, it begins, you see the flow of money and into the state. Initially, the primary focuses of the bill are investments in the construction of healthcare facilities, but also the establishment of public works things, sewer systems in towns, water delivery systems, things that were, had been crumbling since they had originally been built back in the early 20th century within privatized coal camp economies. In education, the focus primarily lands on vocational education, creating VOTEC centers around the state, but they also do invest in university programs and a lot of library projects. On the screen, you see one of our press releases from the Appalachian Regional Commission announcing a grant of $72,118 to Shepherd College in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. I'm not exactly certain what building this was funding. the time period would suggest that it's Eikenberry Hall, I think, but I don't know that Eikenberry Hall was ever an academic structure. I think it's always been administrative, but regardless, this was an investment coming right here to our community, to our campus, out of the ARC. The program continues to expand, especially in the 1970s. The ARC is responsible for creating the corridor highway system in West Virginia, which builds 6 highways around the state and creates a network that sort of puts a connection between the interstate highway system as it runs around the state and through the center of it. So the closest to us here of that project is Corridor H, which runs down through the Potomac Highlands and connects over, is intended to connect I-81 with I-79. That is, if Virginia ever builds their section to connect it over to 81. But in West Virginia, that project is ongoing. Kind of interestingly, my dad was born in the late 50s in Mineral County, West Virginia, and went to elementary school in Burlington. And he's told me before he can remember officials from the state coming to the school with a model of what Corridor H would look like and where it was going to run. And of course, that project is still being constructed and finished today. The ARC's impact, the highways are absolutely the most clear representation of its work. But a lot of major projects across the state are funded in part through the ARC. The New River Gorge Bridge, one of the state's landmarks, is funded partly through the ARC. There are many expansions to airports, to the river transportation systems on the Ohio River and the Kanawha, and lots of investments in infrastructure. Infrastructure really becomes the focus of the ARC in the 1970s, and really up through the 90s when Senator Byrd was in charge of the Appropriations Committee and directing lots of money toward the ARC. Senator Byrd was the most ardent defender of this program. Every 5 years when the bill came up for reauthorization, he was generally the first person and the loudest voice on the floor speaking in favor of its passage, its reauthorization. And then every year in the budget process, he was always arguing for more money to be invested into the ARC. And it certainly has had a marked impact on the state. Has it actually solved all of the socioeconomic issues it set out to solve? No. But what the data does show when you look at the impact of the ARC is that it has closed the gap significantly. When we look at the numbers from West Virginia in 1960 compared to the most recent data drawn up about the ARC, which was in 2010, the poverty rate has dropped by half from what it had been in 1960. And the gap of poverty between national standards and West Virginia levels has narrowed significantly. In 1960, Appalachia's poverty rate was 9% higher than the national average. And in 2010, it was about 2%. So while there's still lots of debate, this is an ongoing debate because this program still exists today. It still requires congressional reauthorization. It still comes up in budgetary debates. But it's hard to imagine West Virginia without the ARC. If you've driven anywhere across West Virginia on any of the corridor highways, it's hard to imagine, getting around this state without the work that the ARC accomplished in the corridor highway system. And when you look deeper and you dig into the records, you really see the full impact that this program has had. And it really did come to fulfill some of the promises that President Kennedy made to West Virginians in the 1960s. President Kennedy's last visit to West Virginia came in 1963. In June of that year, the state celebrated its centennial of statehood. And he appeared in Charleston on the state capitol steps and delivered an address. It was a rainy day. You can tell in the photograph there, everyone has umbrellas. And I'll point out, if you look right above the podium here, underneath the microphone peeking out, is Jennings Randolph. Next to him is Senator Byrd. It's Governor Barron who is speaking at the podium, and of course President Kennedy is standing to the left. He famously started his statement by saying, "The sun doesn't always shine in West Virginia, but its people do." And he gave a beautiful speech about West Virginia, in which he stated, quote, "I would not be where I am. I would not have some of the responsibilities which I now bear if it had not been for the people of West Virginia." West Virginia going in favor of Kennedy was a key demographic for the Democratic Party in advancing what becomes the Great Society. It's a reinforcement of the New Deal Democrats. It's a reinforcement of this idea of federal investment to directly confront and address economic issues. And the state has been forever changed and impacted because of that. It really is a very historic and important election year that has had lasting impacts on the state. So for the last couple minutes, I want to show you what we do with all of this information in educational outreach. We have used this lesson plan several times now with teachers and gotten really good feedback from them on the activities that we built into this program. So you can view this yourselves if you like. It is on the Byrd Center's website, www.byrdcenter.org, where you can go to the Education tab and go to Educational Resources. And that's where we post all of the lesson plans and resources that we've developed for education. The Redeveloping Appalachia platform is designed to be a digital exhibit that can guide students through an introduction to this program and through the legislative process that made it possible, and then also to look at what it has accomplished in West Virginia. And ultimately, we set them up to take on the role of a senator themselves and to debate whether they would keep the ARC around, whether they would continue funding it fully, whether they would change parts of it, or whether they would scrap it and try something else. There were debates right after the ARC was passed in 1965 saying that by removing the human and natural resource focuses of the program, it had essentially neutered this bill out the gate. Because it didn't give it the ability to combat the environmental issues that were impacting the state already at this time and which would be compounded throughout the remainder of the 20th century. It also didn't give it the robust focus for job creation that its framers had originally wanted. Both of those ideas are taken up in national legislation under the Great Society. And that's the reason that they were ultimately removed out of the ARC in its original iteration. But one of the activities that we have the students do comes in the second section of the lesson plan. And we provide them with a series of press releases from the Senator Byrd's collection. You see them on the screen here. And the one that I showed you from Shepherd College is one of them. That's the one that's down here, the kind of tannish colored paper. But we give these out to the students and we have them read them. They're very short documents. Most of them are a paragraph or two. And they have a worksheet which encourages them to pull out specific details, such as what is this project, how much money is being spent on it, where is it located, and since at this point they know that the ARC is targeting education, healthcare, and infrastructure, we ask them to decide which of those three areas is this project addressing. And then we give them a mapping exercise where they take sticky notes and they write on the sticky note the name of their project and the location, and they come up to a map of West Virginia and paste that sticky note on the location where the project was taking place. So we bring in a little geography. Of course, we're teaching them information literacy and working with primary sources by actually engaging with these documents, the press releases. And then we have a conversation about how the ARC looked in its implementation. We get them to discover that a lot of the early projects are education or healthcare focused. And why is that? Well, it's because the infrastructure projects are the really expensive ones, and they're the ones that take much longer to plan, right? A highway is a monumental project because you have to fund it, you have to study where it's going to go, you have to acquire the property and right of way to build it on. In West Virginia, building a divided 4-lane highway often means blasting through sections of mountains to build it, or building massive viaducts. These are huge projects that weren't going to be implemented immediately in 1965. So the documents reveal those things to the students, and it gets them to think about what economic revitalization looks like in policy creation. Something that's really complex, but when you paste it on a map and you make a visual out of it, becomes kind of clear. We also introduce a little bit of mathematics into it because they can look at the dollar figures and sort of assess how much money is being invested in the 3 areas of focus. And then we invite the teachers to extend this. They can repeat this exercise with a second series of press releases that we have from about 10 years later. And again, go into that document and pull out that information. And by this time, you see that heightened focus on infrastructure. That's in these documents. One of these press releases talks about the New River Gorge Bridge. And so that's something that they recognize. They can picture that and connect it to what goes on. And then we provide some materials for the teachers to be able to sort of bring this forward, to bring it up to the now, to connect this program to the community where they're teaching their students, to sort of help their students understand that the impact of this bill is something that they can see right around them anytime. And that sets the stage then for them to kind of take on that role as a legislator themselves and decide, is President Kennedy's vision still what West Virginia needs? Is the Appalachian Regional Development Act still an effective means of reviving the state's economy? And it's interesting when we do this debate with the teachers to see what solutions they come up with. Some of them call for bringing back those older elements that had been initially dropped out, or some of them call for restructuring the power over the ARC. Who should be making the decisions for its funding focuses? And it's really been fun using this lesson plan with teachers. But in the same way, it's also a project that anybody can go to and learn about this era in West Virginia and the way that its congressional representatives at the time tried to address it. And when we look back to the 1960 presidential campaign, that really is the touchstone moment that launches into this era of tremendous change for West Virginia and Appalachia as a whole.